Hi! In this video we're going to kind of put everything together. So let's first recap what we've seen so far. So we have positional arguments. Now positional arguments have a specific sequence, right? They're in a specific position basically in the parameters and therefore in the arguments that we then use when we call the function. So they may or may not have default values. Also we have this star args that we saw, and that basically collects and exhausts any extra positional arguments that are provided in the function call that go beyond what just the positional parameters are in the definition of the function. We also saw the star by itself, which effectively exhausts the positional arguments in the function call, but it will not put them into a tuple, and in fact it will refuse to accept more positional arguments that are specifically defined in the parameters of the function. Then we also have keyword-only arguments. These are arguments that must be passed as a key-value pair. So in the positional arguments, the user may pass them as key-value pairs. But for keyword-only arguments, the user must pass the argument as a key-value pair. And they have to be positioned after the positional arguments have been exhausted, when we set up the parameters, when we define the function. They are also specific. They can have specific names, right? And they may or may not have default values. But then we also have this star-star quargs, which is, again, you know, the quargs, KWARGS, is kind of whatever you want to call it, but it's very similar to the star args. What the star-star quargs does is basically collect into a dictionary any extra keyword arguments that it finds that were not specifically named. So star args will collect any positional arguments that were not specifically named, and star-star KWARGS will collect any key-value arguments that are not specifically named. So let's take a look at it. So this might be, you know, a sequence. I didn't put the commas in here, but there would be commas if we were to use that to define a function's parameters. But these could be the sequence of things that we can put inside a function's parameters. So here you'll see, first of all, we have the positional parameters. So we have A, B, and C are all specific positional parameters, and C has a default value. So they can have default values. Now the non-defaulted parameters are going to be mandatory arguments. In other words, when we call the function, we will have to specify values for A and B, but we can omit the value for C because it has a default. So it's optional. So users may specify these arguments using a keyword. So if they want, they can call our function by saying 1, 2, or they may say A equals 1, B equals 2. So they can specify a keyword argument. Now the keyword has to match the parameter name, and they may or may not use that. It doesn't force them to use it, but they can. Then the next section is this star args or star that comes after the positional parameters. Now the star args basically scoops up any additional arguments that are being passed in that don't match up with the specifically named ones. The star indicates that there are no more positional arguments after this point. So in this case, we would have A, B, and C, and that would be it. The user would not be able to specify more than 3 positional arguments when calling this function. So after we've exhausted the positional arguments, either using star args or star, then come the keyword-only arguments. And they can be specifically named as well. We have KW1 and KW2, which are 2 specifically named keyword-only arguments, which means that the user will have to call it using a keyword argument. Now they can have default values, such as this one here. So of course, if a keyword argument has a default value, it is not mandatory. You don't have to specify it when you call the function. So these are not mandatory, they're optional. Whereas KW1, which does not have a default value, is mandatory. And the user now must specify those keyword arguments using a keyword, right? They have to pass the values to the function using something of the form KW1 equals A or 10 or whatever the case may be. Now, if used, star or star args must also be used. You cannot specify keyword-only arguments unless you've exhausted the positional arguments. And the only way to exhaust the positional arguments is either to accept them and put them into this args tuple, or to say, no, I don't have any more positional arguments. Basically, you would reject any additional positional arguments using just the lone star by itself. And then finally, we have the star star KW args. What this does, it basically scoops up any additional keyword arguments. So any keyword arguments that it finds in the function call that don't match up to the keyword only arguments or don't match up to the positional arguments, it will then throw into this dictionary. So let's look at some examples very quickly. We have, we can call this function A with B equal 10. Two positional arguments, one of them has a default. Here we have two positional arguments. They don't have defaults, so they'll be mandatory. And here we're going to scoop up some additional positional arguments that the user can specify when they call the function. Here it gets a little more complicated. We have two mandatory positional arguments. We can scoop up an arbitrary number of additional positional arguments. And now we have two keyword-only arguments. KW1 is mandatory. It's required because it doesn't have a default. But KW2, is not required. It doesn't because it has a default. So it doesn't have to be specified when we call the function. Now here we have A, we have B equals 10, and here we indicate that's it. That's the only positional arguments we'll accept. We'll only accept two, and there will be A and B. B has a default. So if we don't specify B, it will default to 10. And then we have the keyword arguments that can come after the star. Now, you'll notice a little difference here between the star args and the star. I didn't put a default value for B. Well, if you think about it, and we'll see that in the code, but if you did have a default value for B, and then you accepted other arguments, how would Python know if you specify three positional arguments, let's say? How would it know that the second one and the third one are supposed to go into args, that you're trying to not specify B? You would have a problem, right? You wouldn't be able to do that. It would basically replace B with that value that you're trying to actually put into args. And then the third value, or the fourth value, would go into args. We'll see that in the code. It will become clear. So I didn't put a default here. You can, but it's not very useful if you're also going to, take in and scoop up extra positional arguments. We can also go up to here, right? We have A, B, we scoop up extra positional arguments, we have a mandatory keyword argument, we have an optional keyword argument, and then we can scoop up extra keyword arguments. Or we can do this. We can have A, B equals 10, so now we have a default for B. We then stop accepting positional arguments, and then we have two keyword arguments that are specific, one of which is optional, and then we can scoop up some extra ones. You can, of course, call a function with just an arbitrary number of positional arguments. So you can specify 0 or as many arguments as you want, and that will work. You can also do the same thing with keywords and only accept keyword arguments and as many as you want. So star star KW args will do that for us. And of course, you can combine those two, and you can have an arbitrary number of positional arguments followed by an arbitrary number of keyword-only arguments, and you'll scoop that up into the args tuple and the KW args dictionary. That's actually a very useful syntax right here, and we'll see that in a few, in an upcoming video, probably 2 from now. Anyway, this is just kind of an example of all the different ways you can define these things, and we'll take a look at that again in the code section. So let's look at some typical use cases of, the star args at least, and, when would you use that, or the, when would you use, mandatory keyword, keyword only arguments? What are some of the use cases? And of course, there are plenty. I'm just going to, show you a couple. So the first one is, let's look at the print function that's actually built into Python. If we look at the documentation for the print function, we see that it starts with star objects. Well, remember that star args, that I said is what we typically call it. Well, you can call it whatever you want. That's just the parameter name. In this case, they named it object, so it just says star objects. So that's going to be a tuple that's going to collect positional arguments that you pass to the print function. So that's why we can say print parentheses 1, 2, 3, and it's going to print 1, 2, 3 with a space in between. But now take a look. Now we have some keyword-only arguments. Now they all have a default value. So because of that, it means that they're all optional. So if you say print 1, 2, 3, then it's going to use the default value for sep, which is the separator, which is a space. And that's why when we say print 1, 2, 3, it prints 1 space 2 space 3. And then it does a new line. Well, it does the new line because this is what the end keyword argument's value is. By default, it's a \n, which is a new line. So that's how that works. Now we can override that, therefore. If we want, we can say print 1, 2, 3, and we can specify a different separator. Or we could specify a different line ending character. Or we specify both. We can also change where it's, write it out. In this case, we're just writing it to the standard out, the console, but you could write it out somewhere else. And then flush is something that's a little different. That's really used when because as you're printing to the console, let's say your program is running and you're printing a lot of output to the console, well, sometimes the console can't keep up. And so what you do is you can flush, you can ensure that you've actually written things out to the console. Anyways, what I really want to point out is that here's a typical use case of using keyword arguments, right? Keyword-only arguments. You do that when you want to basically let the function do what it normally does with its positional parameters, but then you modify the behavior of the function, and for that you use keyword-only arguments. All right, so this just goes over what we just discussed. So here's another one. So often keyword-only arguments are used to modify the default behavior of a function, just like we saw in the print function just now. Here's another one, for example. Let's say we have this method here called calc high-low average, and it takes *args. So basically what this function does, it's going to take an unlimited number, an arbitrary number of positional arguments. It's going to look at the minimum value, the maximum value, and calculate the average of those two values. And we have then a keyword-only argument that has a default, which is log to console. So this function will actually calculate that average and return it, but if we specify log to console to be true, then additionally it's going to print out to the console the information about the high, the low, and the average. So that's kind of what I mean by, we can use a keyword approach to modify the behavior of the function, right? By default, the function doesn't log anything to the console, but we set the flag to true, and now all of a sudden it will start logging things to the console for us. So again, that's another typical way of using key value or key only arguments, okay? Keyword only arguments. All right, let's switch to some code and let's take a look at all this in action.